May I start, of course, by welcoming everyone here for the third lecture in the series to celebrate the memory of Dudley Knowles, the lecturer in political philosophy. I'll introduce the speaker and perhaps say a few words about how we come to be celebrating these lectures in the name of Dudley Knowles. Just I should begin perhaps with an apology for those who turned out for the last time this lecture was scheduled. Well done. It was because you didn't get the message. We tried to get the message to everyone about the state of the weather, but most people probably knew it anyway. But we did get one or two emails saying, why did you close the university down? Well, it wasn't us, and it was exceptional. And I'm glad that people have turned out today, despite the disappointment of a month ago. And of course, the weather now is brilliant. So just to remind you, this is the third of these lectures. As you know, the first was given by Lord Raymond Plant, and the second was given by Professor Tadros. Both of these were people who knew Dudley, and we'd made the decision that we wouldn't always invite speakers who'd actually known Professor Dudley Knowles, but it turned out that we've got someone this time round who was also very well known to Dudley and has a lot in common with Dudley. Just to say, for those, I'm not going to go through give a long account of how it came to be called the Dudley Knowles Lecture in Political Philosophy. The brief account is that when Dudley was here and on the Stevenson Committee, we decided we would have a lecture on political philosophy, and we would have at least one every year. Dudley was mindful of the fact that the Stevenson Trust had said that philosophy, politics and economics should all be involved in the lectures, and that politics was sort of making a bit of a takeover of it, given that the public interest in politics was such that he recognised that this would be the direction in which we went, but that philosophy was always an essential part of the study of politics, and philosophy ought not to get lost. We, of course, agreed with Dudley and agreed this should happen. But unfortunately, after Dudley retired, we were thinking we had in the back of our minds that he would do the first in the series, and we'd always have one. And when we got the bad news that within 2 years of retiring, Dudley had died, and we were greatly shocked by that. Anne Knowles, his widow, is here today. But we did feel that continuing these lectures in Dudley's name would be a way of keeping his commitment going. And we're also very, very much concerned that because Dudley endorsed so many of the values of Stevenson, and we've had great political philosophers in the past at this university, but Dudley more than anyone else thought that it was the duty of the philosopher to display his talents and give his service to the community at large, including ethical debates about contemporary issues. And indeed, that's exactly what we have in our speaker today. I'm going to say a few words about David Archard. We call him, it's known as Dave Archard, most of us, but on this on the official agenda, when he writes, and he writes very often, and he publishes at great length, he's always called David. So we're doing that, calling him David today. David's topic, senior citizens, rights, duties, and the old, is, well, for me, a knowledge of knowing David is a new dimension for him, in that much of his work and most of his publications have been in the area of children and family rights. And although he has himself published in other fields, he is most widely known as an expert in those subjects. In fact, when I ran a course on the child, the family and the state, which ran for a number of years, David's book on children's rights in childhood was essential reading, but also on most of the other topics in that course, there was reading, which prescribed reading for Dave Archard, because he, in many respects, has been the recognised expert in discussing children and family rights. Now, I don't know if this departure is a consequence of his recent retirement. I didn't know he was retired when we asked him, but in fact he retired just earlier this year from full-time employment by Queen's University. Belfast. I should say that although he's retired from that job, he has a number of other jobs. Apart from his continued commitment to philosophy, as the Honorary Vice President of the Society of Applied Philosophy, he is now the chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and this is following on from a long-term commitment for 12 years when he was the deputy chair of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. So Dudley, David is continuing with his commitments to public service as a good senior citizen is expected to do. We'll no doubt hear from him what he expects of other senior citizens in the course of the lecture. I won't mention his other publications. I will mention that he was one of his citizen duties was to be a member of the Dundee Children's Panel, which I had forgotten about when thinking of his public duties. So he not only wrote about children, but also looked after their interests. It has always been his association with the teaching of philosophy in Scotland. I should say that although he's now, his final appointment was in Northern Ireland, he was previously a lecturer in Lancaster University, and prior to that in St Andrews. And it was in St Andrews that he had a major role in encouraging Scottish philosophers to get together to study political philosophy. He was a founding member of the Northern Political Thought Conference, which played a major role in ensuring that fellow colleagues throughout Scottish universities got together and discussed pertinent issues. So it was within that role that I'd had most to do with. And I think it had most to do with Dudley as well. Or Dudley was very well known to him in that role. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome David and ask him to deliver his lecture. And if he chooses to say a few words about Professor Dudley Knowles, that would also be good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation to give this lecture, and also for providing me with the opportunity to visit Glasgow, renew friendships with colleagues from my time in Scotland. I want now to memorialise and fondly remember the person in whose name this lecture is given, Dudley. I spent 8 years at St Andrews, and that university's virtues apart, one of the great merits of academic work in Scotland was being a member of an extended intellectual community. Those of you who know the literature will know the notion of the democratic intellect, and that could be found across all the universities north of the border. And Andrew's right, I started the Northern Political Thought Association during my time at St Andrews. And it was in order to bring together political philosophers in philosophy departments and political theorists in politics departments in order to talk about matters of common concern. I should add that the northern of the title was a sneaky way of being able to include Newcastle, which at that time had a very good political theory group. When I started that association, Dudley was the very first person on the list of people I talked to, and he was there at the first meeting, which took place in Hamilton Hall, St Andrews, in the good old days when Hamilton Hall was a hall of residence, not as it is now a commercial block of flats, and where he gave a version, I think, of what became his article on the gratitude theory of political obligation. And Dudley, like all of us, was stunned that you could stand in the downstairs bar of Hamilton Hall and look out on the 18th green and the first tee of the old course. It's well known that students used to heckle those taking part in the Open, particularly Nick Faldo. Dudley combined the passion and the rigour of an absolutely first-rate philosopher with what is uncommon amongst philosophers, namely common sense realism and an informed curiosity about the world beyond academia. And amongst many memories of Dudley, we'll be sharing walks with him. on the Great Wall in China, which we spent talking about football, I think, mostly. And for those who know, walking across Morecambe Sands, which is one of the great walks, doing that with him under the guidance of the famous Queen's Guide, Cedric Robinson. And on that occasion, talking with Dudley, amongst other things, about philosophy, philosophers, one philosopher in particular, birds, the joys of the Northwest, and hill walking. So I'm honoured to be lecturing in his memory. I want to start with two well-known empirical findings. The first could be summarised as the ageing population. Modern developed societies, of which the United Kingdom is a good example, exhibit a marked and increasingly pronounced demographic character, whereby a greater and greater percentage of the population is old, however we understand that term. So by 2040, 1 in 7 Britons will be over 75, and almost a third of the people born today can expect to live to 100. Indeed, the number of centenarians is set to increase 6-fold over the next 25 years, whilst 1 in 12 will be over 80. In 2014, there were 310 people of pensionable age for every 1,000 people of working age in the UK, and that'll increase to 370 in 2039. The second fact is that old people vote. And they played a very clear and pronounced role in one particular recent exercise of our democratic rights, namely the referendum on Brexit. And there was a very marked correlation between age and voting. So, under 25s were more than twice as likely to vote Remain as Leave, whereas 64% of those over 65 voted to Leave, whilst only 36% voted to Remain. So here's a very simple-minded claim against old people. The old are unduly and unfairly burdensome on the rest of society, even whilst they continue to exercise their democratic rights in ways that are prejudicial and damaging to the younger members of their society who have far more to lose than the old. And that's the claim I want to look at and suggest is far too simple-minded, and try and unpack a rather complicated story about the role of the old as citizens within our society. And I'm going to be interested in the question of what exactly we owe our senior citizens and what rights they might have. I'm going to note that we should understand citizenship in the terms that are familiar from the famous essay by Marshall, and also note that he himself did not like the term old age pensioner, which he thought had the same unfortunate terms of dependency as speaking of the indigent or the poor. But crucially, Marshall thought that civic status should be understood not only in terms of political rights, such as voting, but also in terms of claims on various social rights. So, it is true, and it may not be true in a few years in ways I'll explain, that senior citizens consume a greater proportion of social and healthcare resources than other age cohorts. And that's due to the costs of those conditions, diseases, and illnesses that come with old age, increased susceptibility to coronary illness, arthritis, and so on. That set of healthcare costs should be distinguished from the costs we might incur from treating old age as such, that is, trying to arrest the process of aging. And the Nuffield Council on Bioethics that I chair has produced a very interesting briefing note on the ethics and social issues of what is called the new biogerontology, some of which is framed in the most outrageous and ambitious terms that, if you know some of it, that we can actually stop people aging, that there are people who are born now who will live forever, that we can expect confidently to extend life to 1,000 years and beyond. Now, why that's interesting is simply because those who defend the new biogerontology think that extended lifespans, increased life expectancy can be combined with what is called the compression of morbidity, that you'll only experience certain difficult conditions right at the end of one's life and during a very short period of time, and thus the costs of dealing with the old would actually be less than expected. I also want to acknowledge that in addition to the healthcare costs that the old incur, there are arguably social costs, and one of the huge problems for old people is the predominance of isolation and loneliness. Age UK claims that 500,000 people over the age of 60 usually spend each day in complete solitude, and nearly 500,000 more tend not to see or speak to anyone for at least 5 days in any given week. Half of all people over 75 live alone, and what is striking and ironic in some ways is that the loneliness and isolation of old people precisely increases their risk of developing many of the health conditions that then present society with certain increased health costs. And addressing the problems of isolation seems to be an interesting social challenge, and I simply want to mention here one of the great experiments that can be found in Scandinavian countries, but also in Germany, from which this comes, the Mehrgenerationenhäuser. This is multi-generational housing, in which people of different age cohorts live together and share a certain amount of social and recreational space, and here's a nice example. And it works phenomenally well, and it seems to be associated with reduced health costs. But for now, I'm going to assume old people like me and Andrew cost a lot of money. And the longer we live, the more we cost. So, is it ageist that that is the case? Is this a form of unfair, inequitable distribution of resources that the old receive more? The interesting thing here is that normally ageism, as it's used in a lot of public debates, is denying the old people certain goods and resources or treating them less well than other groups. If we provide a disproportionate amount of healthcare costs to the old, we're actually giving them more than we're giving other cohorts. So ageism normally involves depriving people, the old in this case, of certain goods and benefits given to others, and crucially doing so from some kind of prejudicial animus against the group, regarding the old in caricatured or stereotypical terms as frail, dependent, incapable. And I know, having been at various interesting lectures, if you go back to that slide in which I used the warning sign of old people, normally old people crossing the road, note the way in which they are iconically represented as scoliosis, frail, and carrying walking sticks. So the old are represented in ways that aren't fair to the group as a whole. So one thing you might say is, look, it's not ageist to give increased or disproportionate goods to the old, because social provision should be age indifferent. Equitable distribution is sensitive to things like needs and welfare, not to age. Whatever age you are, you get the goods that you need. Moreover, we should adopt what is called a whole life perspective. What you should be concerned with is what you get across a lifetime. And if you get more when you're old, your turn will come. The young will in turn become old, and when they are old, they will get more than they currently get as young persons. What from a slice of life perspective seems unfair can look egalitarian taken across a lifetime. So on that view, it's not unfair and inequitable to devote disproportionate amount of goods to old people. Now I want to look at the other view, the other side. This account has been developed by an American philosopher, Norman Daniels, who thinks that it is fair to spend more money on certain stages of human life and less on later. And he does so by invoking the idea of a prudential lifespan. And what he asks you to imagine is, think for yourself, if you could, in advance, or from behind a veil of ignorance where you don't know how old you are, when you would like money devoted in your lifetime. When would you like more money? When would you like less? And his view, and I won't claim that it's universally accepted, it's been disputed by many, is that it would be rational for you to want more money early in life and in the prime of your life, and less towards the end of your life when arguably it matters less. Then, says Daniel, if that's what makes sense for each and every life, what is fair across a lifetime is a reflection of that distribution. Daniel's view is very close to what is known as a fair innings argument, and I know that Dudley, ever attentive to the nuances of the English language, would be quick to point out that the fair in question has nothing to do with justice or sport. It has the notion of a decent enough, as in a fair wind carried us forth. In other words, a fair innings is a kind of good enough innings. And here the view, very influential, has been what you have an entitlement to is a certain span of life, a fair go at living your life, but beyond that, no claim. And indeed, the resources that would be spent on extending your life beyond what is a fair innings should be devoted in the first innings to ensure that those who have not yet had an opportunity to lead their fair innings should be able to do so. And I thought I would give you a nice early version of it from Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, which invokes a banquet metaphor. Martha Nussbaum has argued this is a classic version of the fair innings argument. And here is Lucretius arguing precisely that if you're sitting at a banquet and you've eaten your fill, you should go. Don't stick around. If you haven't eaten enough, tough. You've had your chance. And if you have eaten enough, you shouldn't be greedy and want more. There are others who deserve a place at the banquet. So why not let a banquet guest who's drunk life to the dregs depart, you dolt, and go to peaceful rest, your mind at ease. Come along, make room for others, leave with your heart light. So it's a classic version of the fair innings argument. You're not entitled to life extension beyond a certain point, any more than a guest who's eaten their fill is entitled to carry on eating. What the Lucretius banquet argument, as well as the Norman Daniels view, as well as the opposed view about turn-taking and age indifference, what all of those arguments suggest is that we have very different views of how old age fits into a lifespan. And just to give you a flavor of the different views you might take as to life as such and getting old, you might take the view that life is sacred, whatever its length. You might think of life as a mere aggregate of years where more is better, and more is better wherever the more occurs. John Harris, the bioethicist, argues precisely that you should think of life as a succession of years. The more you get, the better, because of the opportunities for good things. You might think of life, as Bernard Williams did, the great moral philosopher, as a kind of project or set of projects. And insofar as projects are finite and have a certain arc, when projects are completed and brought to fruition, your life has essentially completed itself. Or very influentially, you might think of life as a narrative whose final chapter is old age. And there's a very, very crucial idea that you find in literature especially, that the final chapter of a human life is that point at which some meaning is retrospectively imparted to everything that has gone before. And apologies to those of you who know me. My greatest hero of all in literature is Charles Dickens, and therefore you're going to get some Dickens, and you're going to get the great character of Sidney Carton from A Tale of Two Cities. plot spoiler coming. Sidney Carton is one of the great Dickens characters in that he's morally ambiguous. He is actually feckless, drunk, and a waste of space. He knows that himself. However, in his final years, he's redeemed by the fact that he falls in love with Lucy, who does not reciprocate his love, but who in fact loves Charles Darnay. And Carton takes the extraordinary decision, this is one of these absurdities of plot narratives, that he is indistinguishable physically from his rival in love, and he mounts the guillotine to take the place of Charles Darnay. And you all know the final words, it's a far, far better thing that I do than I've ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I've ever known. And that wonderful sentence expresses his view that his very final act in life redeems a wasted life. A feckless, pointless life becomes, in a single act, the manner in which he dies, sufficient to give his life a narrative unity and purpose it never had before. That idea is extremely influential. I should say that it is famously opposed by someone, a philosopher such as Galen Strawson, who thinks that it's absurd to think that life is somehow a narrative. For Galen, life is just one damn thing after another. Okay, it's just a succession of events. Don't get caught in this absurd myth that there's a narrative unity to what we do. What does that tell us? It tells us that there are very different views about the meaning and sense that we can give to old age, and that within a view about life as a whole. Those different views of the purpose and meaning of life and the place that old age has within it reflect deep-lying moral, religious, cultural views about human life and about age. And those views are what political philosophers would say are the subject of reasonable disagreement. Reasonable disagreement amongst the citizens of a democracy about the meaning of the life that each of us must lead. If there is such reasonable disagreement, it can only be resolved through democratic deliberation. And if that's the case, old age citizens have as much right as anyone else to be part of the debate. However, should we give a voice to those whose views, as expressed in votes, will outlive them? In the immediate bitter aftermath of the Brexit result and anger on the part of the Remoaners about the disproportionate role that had been played by old people in swinging the vote in favour of Brexit, one metaphor or analogy that was cited, I think in The Guardian, was that allowing the older voter to determine an outcome was rather like allowing some in a group to choose which film we all go out to see, only for those to leave after 20 minutes. The point being, the old will determine what the outcome is, but they won't be around to see it. They'll be dead. Why should we allow the old then to play the role they do? Now, that charge against the old is strictly speaking neutral between their preferences. So if the preferences of the old had actually been the exact mirror opposite of those they did express, that is, that the vast majority of old people had been Remainers and the vast majority of young people had been Brexiteers, then I am sure if the referendum had gone the other way, the likes of Nigel Farage would have made exactly the same complaint against the role of old people as was made by Guardian reading Remainers. The point essentially is, why do we give a vote to old people when they're no longer around to see its effects? And the more serious view is that any rights of citizenship and participation in political decision-making should depend on having an interest or stake in what is determined. And call that the those affected principle. Only if you're affected by a decision should you have any say in it. And that principle allows us to answer two questions. Who gets the vote? Only those who are affected by the voting outcomes. And does everyone who has the vote get the same vote? No. The weight of the vote should be proportionate to the degree to which one is affected by the outcome of a vote. And lest you think that's a crazy view, the second one has been defended very intelligently by the American philosopher Harry Brighouse, arguing that actually you should think about democratic votes in scalar or proportionate terms rather than you either have the vote or you don't. And this raises a general question for democratic theory and civil theory about where you put the boundaries of the citizenship, who you include in the citizenship, and how far you regard all within those boundaries as having the same basic rights. Now, a simple principle, only those who are affected by a decision, is going to be far too inclusive. Everything that any state decides to do is going to have impact beyond its own boundaries. And as we sit waiting to hear what Donald Trump is going to do to change the world, you should bear in mind that the decisions taken in America will have monumental decisions for the rest of the world. And similarly, any decisions we make within the UK have ramifications beyond our boundary. So those who are affected lie beyond our own boundaries. And we should not get too hung up on the idea of physical boundaries or geographical boundaries, because those who are affected by decisions now include those who are yet to be born, future generations. And indeed, some have argued that we ought to find a place to represent the interests of those who are not yet exercising adult citizens' rights or those who are yet to be born. I think the simple fact is that age is not a good or reliable indicator of the degree of stake individuals have in outcomes. It's going to vary across different decisions and different outcomes. Some outcomes are going to be very short-term and immediate and dramatic, others are going to be enduring. And remember too that age alone is not the best indicator of the stake in any particular interest. That may have even things to do with where you are living, your own particular interests, what you're employed at, and so on. So a stake or interest is going to vary across issues as well as across age cohorts. It's standard to say that those who have the right to vote and to have a certain civic status are not simply those who might have an interest in what is being decided, however we understand that, but also those who are competent. So there are standard exclusions from the right to vote. The incarcerated, and I should note here that historically there have been two reasons to exclude the incarcerated, the long-term incarcerated from the right to vote. One was that simply to be imprisoned was just to lose status within society. It was to cease to be a member of the community that you once were. But there is another influential view, which is that you lose the moral entitlement to participate in democracy by virtue of the crimes you've committed. And indeed, there were echoes of that in the Conservative government's response to the European challenge on the failure to grant UK prisoners a right to vote. There was something morally repugnant about people who put themselves outside the moral pale continuing to play a role in democracy. The insane don't have the vote, and famously, the very young don't. And if they have a common theme, those three categories, it might be thought to be that in order to vote, you need the possession of a certain competence. That qualifies you at a minimum to vote. So those with the vote must be both affected by what it is that the vote concerns and able to understand what is involved in exercising a vote. So would that be sufficient to exclude the old? It might be, it seems to me, very quickly. I'm happy to say more, but I think age alone, again, is not going to be a reliable indicator, at least at the other end of life, of incompetence. And my view, and many others who write in this area, is that trying to determine exactly what competence we require of voters is one thing, difficult enough, but then finding a reliable way of indicating what it is, devising a test that would allow us to exclude those who are incompetent to vote would be almost beyond the guise of humanity. So, I think we do not engage in inequitable behavior as a society when we devote certain social and healthcare costs to the very old. That we need very carefully as a society to work out what exactly it is that we owe the old because of their particular membership of an age cohort. There is a remaining question, and that is whether we owe more to the old than to any other age cohort. Dudley, I may have mentioned, was famous for defending an unpopular theory of political obligation, namely that you should obey the laws of any state because you should be grateful for the benefits and services the state has provided you with, a theory that goes back to the Greeks, but was long discredited until Dudley resurrected and defended it very ably. Maybe on a gratitude theory of obligation, where you owe something to people who've done something for you, and certainly done more than they should have, maybe we owe more to those who have done more. And maybe the old have simply done more for us and our society than any other age cohort, if only because they've lived longer and provided a longer period of service. Unfortunately, that's not exceptionless. There are many old people who are free riders, many old people whose contribution to society has been a negative rather than a positive one, and we should never again regard age as a straightforward, simple indicator of overall service. Should we owe more to the old because they're wiser? There's a view that the old are due a certain veneration because of their greater wisdom, or, at least in the Chinese tradition, we might be thought to owe more to the old simply because they are old. I've seen that view very nicely defended by using the analogy of how far you admire trees that are 100 years old. In some sense, they have been around for a long time. They've survived. Do we not owe more to the old just because they have weathered the storms of human life? I don't think the old are as such wiser, and I'm not convinced that we should show deference to the old simply because they have survived as they have. But I want to conclude with the thought that I'm only going to sketch and that intrigues me. And to illustrate it, I'm going to give you a bit of personal history. The thought here is that the old might be the guardians of the collective memories of any society to which they belong. And the personal story is that as a very young person, before I went to university, I spent a summer on a kibbutz in northern Israel. I did so in my innocence, not as a supporter of the Israeli state, but rather as what I was then, namely a very simple-minded utopian young socialist who thought that kibbutzim offered a fantastic example of self-sufficient, self-governing, egalitarian communities. I returned 3 months later considerably wiser about kibbutzim and Israel and a certain version of socialism. But there was one element of the kibbutzim to which I went, one element of its organization that deeply impressed me at the time. The kibbutz had been founded by Russian Jews of the diaspora. And every week, the young of the kibbutz, and this kibbutz was very, very orthodox in terms of the kibbutz experiment, namely the children were collectively reared They were removed from their biological parents at birth and brought up in collective nurseries. And when I was there, they'd relaxed the rule of contact with biological parents to allow the children one afternoon a week with their parents. And there were many on the kibbutz who thought that was an outrageous concession and departure from the ideal. If you know the great book by Bruno Bettelheim, Children of the Dream, it's a very nice account of how far that experiment failed. But every week, the children of the kibbutz spent time with the old people. There was a room reserved for them, and during that period of time, the old simply told stories about their own history, what it meant to be a Jew in Russia, why the Israeli state had been formed, how they had come to Israel, how they had come to be part of that particular kibbutz. And in that manner it was thought the old were the guardians of the remembrances of a past life. Remembrances that might inform and justify the institutions of the present and subsequent avatars of the kibbutz. Now, those weekly sessions had other functions. It provided a very nice form of intergenerational social contact, where normally there is none. Old and young people don't often have opportunities to meet together. It gave the old on the kibbutz, who were beyond an age at which they could usefully contribute to work. It gave them a purpose and value. It was educative. It was, in the best sense, real oral history. But above all, it demonstrated how the senior citizen might possibly have a distinct status within any society as the custodians of that society's past, just as the young are the custodians of its future. So, perhaps what we need to give the old is their own proper voice, respected as the voice of the old, just as we're frequently enjoined to listen to young people as having their own distinctive voice that's worth listening to. Thank you.
Tell you this because I didn't want to alarm you to begin with, but I thought that on other occasions we've had that we should have a respondent to the philosopher offering the paper. On this occasion, I thought it should be the privilege of the chairman, which is a long tradition in Stevenson of bolder chairmans than I. So I'm going to make 3 points in relation to what David has said. Before I open it to the floor, I shouldn't take more than 10 to 15 minutes. So let me begin, David. The first, one of the things I said at the beginning was David has written and been very interesting for a long time in talking about the rights of children. And I thought therefore that might be a good way of seeing how he deals with the rights of the old compared with the rights of children. Then they being, the justification for that, I suppose, is that they are the only other legitimate category of rights receivers that we differentiate by age. The easy thing about children is that we have a legal definition of who they are. Even if we, however, there are a range of definitions, but we follow the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's important, that convention, because it tells us who are to be regarded as children, those up to the age of 18, or to 16 if the state gives majority rights before that, but normally it's up to the age of 18. And it makes the point of differentiating some rights which belong to children in virtue of them being children. In other words, to say that children should have human rights, but some rights they should have specially because they're in this age category. So I wonder when, if we talk and think about old people, whether we should also be thinking the same, or should we continue, as we do when we're differentiating rights, to privilege children in certain respects. That convention does privilege children in certain respects, both for their protection and for their development. And one of the things it underscores is that they are entitled to participate in decisions which affect them. That's Article 12 in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's quite an important convention because it's made a significant difference to the way we have treated those below the age of 18 children. We've taken account of their views insofar as they have them. We're taking due regard, as the word is, as the formulation of the principle is, due regard of their maturity and their age. Well, simply, is probably the maturity. How we still end up judging what weight to give their views, but we differentiate them, and having views we ought to be taken account of. There are no equivalent rights of adults, by the way, to say that they are entitled to have their views taken into account in all matters which affect them. Well, maybe we think that is sort of underlying the democratic principle in some ways. We specify it for children, particularly perhaps because we think they are vulnerable to the decisions of others, or they aren't taken into account. Now, do we have the similar entitlement, that similar entitlement for old people? Well, I'm not so sure. But anyway, if we compare the two, and that's a sort of starting position, one of the things that's different, of course, is that we know how long childhood is. We have a pretty clear, and anyone who survives as a child, we know they've got 18 years. Thinking about David's point about a fair innings, well, I'm not sure how long old age is, partly because the way David defined it, and originally with the information that he set up at the beginning, the facts, he used the notion of pensionable age. I perhaps shouldn't talk about pensions at the moment. It's a sensitive matter. But the concept of pensionable age is also tricky because we change that about a bit. Probably what we mean most of the time is the age at which you're entitled to receive a state pension. Of course we can change, and we do, depending on how long you're going to be alive. But the concept that David offered us in talking about justice over a lifetime, the balance of a lifetime, one thing we know how long we get as children, we don't know how long we're in this category of a pensionable age. In fact, the distribution of that is pretty random, pretty wild. Should it be a similar amount, should it be less? That makes a difference if you're looking for justice over a lifetime. How long am I going to be old? Yeah. That's the first thing. The other thing about that, what the position David presented was comparing expenditure on the elderly or those of age within health and social services, the demands they put on the health service. Now, leaving out infant care, paediatrics, which is quite expensive actually, but leaving that out, we probably spend perhaps less on the care of children. We did perhaps, however, if we take into account their education, if we take into account other expenditure of other resources on that age group, it might not look quite the same in terms of, if it's terms of state expenditure. Now, of course, we might argue in relation to children, well, we're investing in our long-term future. It's not just on the resources they consume, we're doing it for our own, for their benefit, so they'll look after elderly people, so they look after the rest of us. Well, and we don't have any expectations of older people. Well, maybe not. We certainly don't spend money on their education after a certain point. I want to come back to this. So my first point is this one about comparing that old people with children and seeing who we privilege. But by the way, the amount of expenditure and effort we place on child protection in social services is pretty massive. And we don't, it seems to me, provide the same commitment of resources to protection of elderly adults. But that's another matter. Maybe we're right to privilege children in this way. But if we were comparing those two groups, I'd say we actually do rather well with children and rather less well with adults. That's the first thing I want to raise. The second one is this about voting. The principle of those who are affected by the vote. Well, first thing to say is that David operated with one particular theory of voting. That's to say, we vote in our own interest, or it's our self-interest that we somehow pursue. So that those philosophers that say, well, it's the degree to which you're affected, they're operating with a notion that we vote in order to represent our own interests. If we had a theory of voting which said, actually, when we're voting, we're not looking to our own interests, we're making a judgment about the collective interest, or we're taking into account the common interest, then it wouldn't quite look the same. We wouldn't be saying, well, look, those people are making a judgment about the common interest are somehow less or more affected. But even if we pursue the notion of being affected by it, are we to say that we are not affected by decisions which we make? We have no interest in what happens after we're dead? Well, this of course has been a problem for philosophers who are trying to differentiate what should count as a rational basis for decisions, when we know that some decisions are going to be made that we're going to continue beyond us. And the standard view of that is that we have an interest in our children and our children's children. That's the kind of Rawlsian principle, is that if we're thinking of a person and they're using their vote wisely, they are concerned with the interests of their children and their grandchildren. Now, whether you still have grandchildren or not, I don't know. Whether some people think about the dynasty, I'm interested in my family indefinitely, or whether we transfer that commitment to our community or our state, that we're interested in the interests of the next 2 generations at least, before we use up the world's limited resources, before we pollute it excessively. But concern about pollution and the use of expendable resources doesn't seem to be confined to people who think, well, I'm not going to be around when we run out of petrol, I'm not going to be around when the oceans are full of muck, because most of us, or at least it is reasonable to assume that we are concerned and will have a concern about the interests of our children and our grandchildren at least. Well, if you haven't got children, maybe you will, like the books, take on some belief that you share in the future of others who you're not biologically related to. So that's the first idea. But the idea that we only consider we're not going to be affected because personally we won't be alive seems to be an extremely limited notion of what counts as being affected. And it's also an extremely narrow and contentious view of what is voting. So that's my second point about voting. The third point is, well, to be honest, I'd expected quite a bit more about the duties of the elderly, rather than viewing them, simply thinking about what rights should they still enjoy. Because I think we make a mistake if we think we don't have the same moral duties once we reach a certain age, or that or we're incapable of contributing to the well-being of others in terms of duties. I also have this slight problem with children as well. We don't recognise the duties which they have. But under-emphasising the importance of duties is under-emphasising that which I think is important in the concept of community. It's the obligation to do things for others. And I think old people do an awful lot for others, and they ought to. They have a duty to. I was looking today, just briefly, at the role of grandparents and what grandparents contribute to the next generation. So you might say, well, that's a private duty, it's not a public duty. Well, some recent research on what's happened in Ireland, I saw there's a report that grandparents now are doing more childcare to enable women who've had children to go out to work, and that's beneficial to the economy, and that's happened because the cut in child welfare provision for mothers with children has led to less state-provided welfare. And I'm reminded of the research that a colleague did in the Centre of the Stolen Child here when he was in the department, looking at the role of grandparents, and what he came up with and found was that in many cases, the disadvantaged children who are in trouble, the greatest resource which they had available to them, and which was used and appreciated, was the role of grandparents. Grandparents did an awful lot to to save the state the cost of children whose actual parents were, for various reasons, unable to look after them. So the contribution of grandparents has always been massive, has always been significant. And then, well, that's therefore looking at the duties of the aging generation to future generations, of their current responsibilities, isn't just to tell them stories about how things used to be in the past. And of course, it's one of their rights and duties to assist in child rearing. And I think that's a very important one. And it's economically very important as well. It's a continuing economic. Now, of course, looking after grandchildren is a privilege and a pleasure, as well as a burden. The interesting thing, there's another piece of research which is on grandparents, which says if you look after grandchildren, your health is likely to improve. But apparently that only happens for female grandparents. The health of male grandparents, there's no evidence that it improves in childcare. Now, some of you may be surprised at that, but people aren't being pulled around on the floor. I'm not at all surprised. But so there's a mutual benefit to be derived, it seems to me, in the service which grandparents give. Yeah. And the final point is it isn't only within the family context that the older generation make a substantial and contribute and have a duty to do so, contribution to the well-being of our society. But if you look at any of the organizations of civil societies and see who is making communities happen or communities work, who are exercising the initiatives, they're largely those people who are no longer in full-time employment. In fact, the Age Cohort makes a massive contribution. And it has a duty to continue to do so to our society. And I thought perhaps they didn't give enough weight or importance to the concept of duties of the elderly. Okay. But that's just my reflections. Now it's open to the floor. And Dave, first of all, Dave, do you want to respond to any of the things I've said?
Just very, very quickly. I think there's a very interesting problem of dealing with the old as an age cohort and using the young as an analogue. And the reason I got interested in this is precisely because I had written for a long time on childhood. There's very little written by normative philosophers about old age. And I just thought it was interesting as to why. There's a lot written about immortality and there's a lot written about the overall value of a life. There's stuff written on narrativity. But just the place of old age within a human life is not well treated. And the best book on it I recommend is by Helen Small, called Long Life, and she's actually a professor of literature, but she uses philosophy as well as literature to try and make sense of it. But the puzzle is this, is that in a sense, when you're a child, everything comes after. When you're old, everything has already happened and come beyond. There's a certain asymmetry. So we're not Benjamin Buttons, who are basically getting back towards the state of being an infant. The span, life's arrow runs in a certain way. The span of a human life has a certain particular direction and arc. And it's trying to make sense of what old age's functional purpose is within that. Secondly, I didn't want to endorse a particular view of voting. I was simply dealing with the standard objection, why give a vote to old people because they're not going to be around? Well, that's a version of we shouldn't give the vote to people who are not affected by outcomes. That's a bad view of why we give people the vote. I certainly think it should be open to view the old as having duties. And what's interesting is in current social gerontology, we're moving towards the view that there is actually now what's called a third and a fourth age. So beyond the period of active work, there's going to be a pensionable period, and then a period where maybe you've got time and space to do a lot more than you ever thought you could do, and it might be possible to open up the question of what you as an old person now owe the society to which you belong, beyond simply pushing the pension age further and further down the road. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thanks. Contributions to the floor. Can we just have the usual principle that you will just You don't have to say how old you are, by the way, but if you want to identify who you are and anything about you that's relevant to your question or response, then do so. Bear in mind that the proceedings are recorded, so that anything you would say will be on tape and held against you for as long as your life is, however long that may be. Gentlemen.
Thank you, David. I'm Glenn Pettigrove, and I like the idea of the custodian of collective memory and of continued identity. And it fits really nicely with one of the roles that is important in Maori culture in New Zealand, which is where I've just come from. But I have a question about the relationship between this story and the rights language that you were using, at least in the title and in some of the packaging. Because the custodian image is a functional image. And one of the dangers of introducing a functional image into discussions of rights is that the right then might not be extended to those who don't perform the function, or we might have limited need for functionaries. According to the university, we need roughly one person performing the function of lecturer per 250 students. And so if we have something like that arrangement with respect to collective memory, then perhaps those with the right to continued existence or continued function within society would be quite diminished, and we might then have to give priority to those who have better memories or more robust identities than others. So would invite your reflection on the tension between those two.
No, sure, thank you. I hope, want to argue that we have a duty to listen to the old because they're the guardians of our past, or that they have a right to be the custodians of that past because of having lived sufficiently long. It was rather in the context of exploring what it is that the old might be valued for as members of our community, and not being happy with the standard view that they were simply wiser, not being happy with the view that they had simply done more, not being happy with the view that they just simply lived longer, but maybe there was something in the view that they were the guardians of an inherited collective memory. Actually, I think there's far more. This came up in an earlier version of this. Someone raised the question of, well, look, you know, we are quickly losing our memory of certain events, because if you do all these standard questions of school children and ask them about events in comparatively recent history or to identify well-known figures, they just can't. And I was always horrified by how short the time span was of my students. And I don't just mean, you know, the sort of within the period of a lecture, I mean just historical lifespan. Their notion of history is about 20, 25 years. So in that sense, maybe the old have a value to pay. But I'm actually more worried about questions of, well, they might be bad custodians. They might be unfaithful, untrustworthy custodians of the memory. They might be biased and prejudiced custodians of that collective past. They might have axes to grind. So it's a first tryout for an idea which I'm not necessarily persuaded will run, but there seems something about it that might be worth doing. But the straightforward answer to your question is the language of rights does not exhaust the moral space within which we can evaluate various practices, events, and institutions. I didn't want to suggest we can only talk about anything as valuable within the language of entitlements and rights. Yeah.
There's a couple there. Oh, sorry.
I'd just like to go back to Lucretius and the banquet allegory. Now, Cardinal Basil Hume was from Newcastle. He died at 76 years of age in 1999. He also speaks at the banquet that we are all sparrows that come out from the cold into the banquet hall. We don't eat or dine. We just spend time in the warm banquet hall. But then we leave that banquet hall and go back out into the cold. But he speaks of a light, and we have just celebrated Easter. and the death of Jesus Christ and the rising and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that was the message that he gave before he died. He talked about a fundamental truth, not the allegory of Lucretius and the eating and the dining in the banquet hall, but the short lifespan of the sparrow in the wall.
Thank you, thank you. Remember, De Re Natura is a secular poem about the meaning of life, and it's possible to overinterpret the verses, and I think Martha Nussbaum may do so in respects, but I just wanted to say two things that are going on in the argument that are worth highlighting. One is the fair innings argument, the idea that basically you're entitled to live a certain lifespan, but no longer. And by the way, to answer your question, the standard version of the fair innings invokes the Bible's 70. In other words, if you think there is a natural lifespan to 70 years, that's what you're entitled to. Okay? If lifespan extends beyond 70, then that's what you're entitled to. But you're not entitled to any more. That's the first element of it. So you're entitled at least to sit at the banquet for a certain period of time. The second element is when you've exceeded your stay, you're denying others the opportunity to come and enjoy what you've been able to enjoy up to that point. And that's an argument about distributive justice. In continuing to stay at the banquet, you're denying others the right to access certain goods. So the fair innings argument actually has two important elements, both of which can be contested. One is that you have a fundamental entitlement to a certain lifespan. Secondly, not only do you not have a right to any extension beyond that, but in making a claim on resources to live longer than your natural lifespan, you're denying others who might not yet have come to that point. So I think it's probably worth, raising here the spectre of immortality. You know, the sober and cautious biogerontologists don't think that in the next 100 years we're going to do much more than extend lifespan by about 25 years is the figure I've seen. So I'm going to get the technical terms wrong, so if there are any gerontologists in the room, correct me. The two crucial terms here are life expectancy at a given age, and the standard one is life expectancy at birth. Once you're born, how long can you expect to live? And that's normally the average for that.
The average age of death, that's all it is.
Lifespan is what's the maximum life that any human could have. Okay, so we are extending the lifespan, so it's over 100 now. That's distinct from life expectancy, but life expectancy is also increasing dramatically. But most interestingly, life expectancy increased dramatically without increasing lifespan 50 years ago, and that was by reducing infant mortality. In other words, you could expect to live longer, but once you got over infancy and childhood, you probably were not going to live a longer life than anybody else. So it's important. But there are those who seriously believe that there is no limit in principle or indeed in medical practice to the human lifespan. And it could be infinite. And that is because senescence, the process of getting old, cellular degeneration, can be arrested. And if we can do that, then there's no reason we shouldn't make it possible for human beings to live forever. The arguments around whether that's a good thing are, it seems to me, very different from the arguments about whether or not it would be a good thing to increase lifespan by 20 years. Right? So philosophers have written about immortality and have thought that immortality is, on the whole, a bad thing. Bernard Williams is the most famous and thinks that an immortal life would be a tedious and boring life, a life which you would choose to end. It would be so bad. Does anyone know the Julian Barnes History of the World in 8.5 chapters? Okay, so if you don't read the last short story in it, which is a picture of heaven, with apologies, a very secular Julian Barnes picture of heaven, and it imagines someone who wakes up to all the infinite possibilities of a good life forever. And in his particular case, he's a golfer. And he so enjoys He so enjoys playing golf every day that he quickly brings down his handicap to 0, and then he's able to go around an 18-hole golf course in 18 shots. No further improvement is possible. And he realizes he's condemned to a life, an eternal life, of playing any golf course he wants, 18 holes every time, and he despairs and asks his guardian angel, "Can I end it now?" Because immortality and an eternal existence is going to be intolerable. Oh, sorry. But the arguments around immortality are very different from the arguments around life extension.
I suppose my interest is in human flourishing on this earth, and you didn't really explicitly address human rights, and I suppose internationally the case for making older people, and there is an argument for making older people a particular group in terms of human rights, would be the extent to which globally their human rights are violated, and whether you take the right to life or in human degrading treatment, we think in our own culture about financial exploitation, we might feel that older people are a group where you might make the case that their human rights are particularly vulnerable. And the reason for making that case, of course, would not be to turn older people into victims, but to emphasize societal accountability for protecting their rights and empowering them to access them better. And I was just interested that you didn't really refer to human rights.
Andrew may know this interesting literature that's developed on the idea that there are inherent goods of childhood. So there was a view that you treat children fairly or equally when you don't deny them on age-based terms any set of goods or resources that you would give to any other age cohort. But there is a view now that there are particular goods that are specific to children. That is, they're valuable to children but not to adults, and that we ought to provide children with the opportunities to enjoy a certain set of goods. Amongst those that have been mentioned are innocence and play, in literature by Anka Ghosh and Colin MacLeod. Now, it did strike me that could you run a similar argument about old age? That it's not enough simply not to discriminate against the old on the grounds of their age. It's not enough not to treat them in certain ways based on a false or prejudiced or animus-driven view of what the old are like, but the old are entitled to certain goods, things that have value for them, but perhaps for no other age cohort. And I'm not sure what those goods might be. Oh, yeah, yes, certainly, in choosing the manner of one's departing. But I do think that some goods might have more significance and value for the old. So I mentioned those rather horrible Age UK statistics about the isolation and loneliness of old people. And there are, it seems to me, relational or social goods that are important to human flourishing. The ability to enter into relationships, to enjoy friendships, to have conversations, to be seen as a valued member of the community. And those goods seem to me have a particular significance and value when you're old, because one of the things that happens to you when you're old and retired is, most will complain, you seem to lose the purpose and function that is conventionally given to you as a member of society, that is, as an active worker, as discharging certain professional functions. Now, all you are is a retired person, and you may find yourself without the kinds of relationships and valued links to others that makes your life a flourishing and enjoyable one. So whilst I'm not convinced that there might be inherent goods of old age to mirror inherent goods of childhood, it might be the case that some goods have a very particular significance and value for the old, and social or relational goods seem to be precisely the ones that come top of the list, as it were, if that's a, yeah.
I've got the microphone, Andrew. Can I claim it? Is that all right? John Curtis, University of Strathclyde. The central nub of your argument about how we should value older people is this idea that they're the custodians of a collective identity. Can I suggest that the crucial word there is collective, and that what the Brexit vote revealed, to which you referred at the beginning, is that there isn't necessarily a collective sense of identity across their generations, that older people were looking at a rather different vision and a sense of identity about Britain's place in the world than were younger people. And to that extent, at least, arguably, by the end of your lecture, you re-described the problem that you came up with in the first place.
Yeah. No. I should simply say on a personal level that I didn't speak to my 96-year-old mother for a month when I learned how she'd voted. She now claims she was misled, and she said if the referendum was held again, she'd change her mind. But that's maybe because my brother and I made it evident to how angry we were with her for having voted the way she had. No, I mean, your point's well made one. And it goes back to the earlier answer. I mean, it's far too simple-minded to say that the old as a group can act in some simple-minded way as the collective guardians of an agreed memory or an agreed inheritance. And that idea, if it's to have any mileage in it, is going to have to be finessed in various kinds of ways. Otherwise, as I said, the old could be quite straightforwardly prejudiced, ignorant, untrustworthy guardians. Or, as you're suggesting, there's no such thing as a collective. There's no single agreed homogeneous collective memory or identity. There are different accounts of what it means to be a member of this particular society. What I didn't quote, but is there in the written version, is the famous Edmund Burke line about a nation being a contract between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. And the thought was that, very, and I don't think that's essentially a conservative idea. That's the view that what makes us the particular community we are is the links we forge both into the past and into the future. But those links are contested, debated, controversial, endlessly disagreed about. So it's not that the old will speak with a single voice about what it means to be British or to be a member of a particular community, but they at least speak as the rememberers of a past. So when I'm in a good mood with my mother, one of the things that's most interesting to talk to her about is to hear yet again the stories about the Second World War, which she was in a uniquely privileged position, working for Bomber Command, to talk about. And there are stories that I've written down because I think otherwise they'll be lost. And because she's by no means a simple-minded, naive little Englander, far from it. But those events that are all too quickly being forgotten, I think, it's important that they're kept alive through the memories of those who lived them, and lived them in different ways and remember them in different ways. So let me give a non-English example, since I live in Belfast, and since my wife is an Irish nationalist. We both went down to Dublin 2 years ago as part of the centenary celebrations of 1916 and the Easter Rising. And the Easter Rising is one of the deeply contested events in Irish history, seen by some as one of the first great manifestations of physical force, republicanism, asserting the right of the Irish people to be free of British domination. To others, it was a despicable, cowardly, awfully ill-judged event which set back the cause of Irish nationalism many years. But the most interesting thing is many of the people who are involved can still remember that event and can still tell stories about what happened, even if they do so in ways that are not necessarily always in agreement. And a great effort was made leading up to the anniversary to try and get as much of the oral history in place that otherwise would be lost forever as to what that event meant.
It seemed to me that you were thinking there was something to the thought that those closer to death are lesser stakeholders in our society, because you were trying to find a special property that the old had that sort of ameliorated this effect. And I guess I found that assumption or that premise or thinking that way really quite objectionable for many reasons. One was, for example, on average, people in Drumchapel live shorter lives than people in Bearsden, but I don't think that they're lesser stakeholders, their vote should count less. In fact, maybe the opposite. Likewise, on average, people in Glasgow tend to live shorter lives than people in London. I don't think that people from Glasgow should be thought of as lesser, as having less of a stake in society, or that their vote should count less. So I guess I'm really sceptical of going down the line that you need to find some special property of old people to begin with, because when you're going to die, when you're likely to die, when it's reasonable to anticipate someone might die, just shouldn't really be figuring into our thinking in these matters.
I just want to be clear that there's two issues that might be conflated. One is about whether or not the old should be restricted in their possession of certain civic and political rights because they're not going to outlive the impact of the decisions to which they contribute. That's one, and the response to that was that the affected principle shouldn't operate in the determination of who has democratic rights. But the other sense in which the other issue at play is, does it make a difference to how we understand and value some period of human life that is closer to death? John Harris has a view as a bioethicist that what matters is more years, where you don't know how many more years you've got. And that shouldn't enter into a calculation of the value of those additional years. They're valuable as additional years without reference to the closeness to death or the finitude of the number of extra years. I think it's fascinating if you look at average lifespans and remind yourself of how short life was 100 years ago. And part of me thinks that you have a conception of the narrative arc of your life in terms of a recognition that it does have a finite span, even if you can't be absolutely sure what the number is, or within what rough margin it operates. And then it seems to me it makes a difference how close you are to death as to what value you give to those extra years you know you have. But I don't want to diminish. This is not a claim about human lives at a certain period of their life are of less value because of proximity to death. That's not the claim. It's the value and purpose, it's the value to the person who leads the life of being close to death. Or its purpose, or its meaning, or its significance.
This is to you with your bioethicist hat on, really. Part of the logic or the thread of your talk was age is really just a statistical fact, and building anything upon that is difficult. You've got a case where there is one heart, you've got an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old. Should you just toss a coin? It's the logic of your argument, you just toss a coin, who gets the heart?
This may be partly what Fiona's getting at, so she can nod or frown accordingly. But certainly if you try, or I do my students on, you don't have a heart, but you can have a life-preserving or a life-continuing form of medication, and it's such that whatever age you are, it'll add another 5 years to your life. Your choice is to give it to a 95-year-old or a 25-year-old. Who should you give it to? And I can wager when you ask any class of students, the vast majority say the 25-year-old, not the 95-year-old. And if you ask them to explain it, they will say things like, well, the 95-year-old has had their go. They shouldn't get any more years. The 25-year-old is only just started. Their extra 5 years will have far more significance value than the 95-year-old. The response by people like John Harris in bioethics is, that gets it wrong. We should simply be indifferent to a person's age in the provision of any medical or health resource. And we should be indifferent in the same ways that it shouldn't matter to us what the gender of the patient is, or the ethnicity of the patient, or the geographical location of the patient. All that matters is that you can provide that person with more years. What age they are when they receive the greater number of years is irrelevant. And that, by the way, the response to that is that can't be right. And that's the intuition of the students, that can't be right. And I suspect when people say it can't be right, they appeal to the fair innings argument. It's the 95-year-old has had it. They've had their go at a good life. The 25-year-old is still a long way off a natural lifespan, so it's only fair that they should get closer to it than the 95-year-old be granted 5 more years. I don't think, incidentally, but the 95-year-old won't do much good with the extra 5 years, but the 25-year-old might. I don't think that's it.